Welcome to Lotus Light Teachings, where timeless wisdom meets modern understanding. Today, we embark on a profound journey together, exploring the great debate between Carl Jung's concept of self and the Buddha's teaching of no self. This isn't just philosophy, it's a mirror for your own mind, a path to clarity, and a gateway to inner peace. Let's dive deep and uncover the mysteries of who we truly are. Have you ever wondered who you truly are? Not just your name, your job, or your memories, but the essence of you. What if that you was a story you've been telling yourself? A story that could vanish like mist in the morning sun. Let me take you back to two very different times and places. 1. A quiet study in Switzerland in 1939, where Carl Jung, a brilliant psychologist, was surrounded by books on Eastern wisdom. He was writing about the self, that central point of psychological wholeness. 2. Ancient India, beneath a Bodhi tree, where a prince named Siddhartha Gautama sat in silent meditation. His realization that this thing we call the self doesn't exist in the way we think. At first glance, their ideas couldn't seem more different. Jung spent his life mapping the self, while the Buddha spent his life dismantling it. And yet, as we'll discover, these two great minds weren't opposites. They were explorers, journeying from different directions to the same timeless truth. This truth isn't just for them, it's for us. Because the question of who we are lies at the heart of all our struggles, joys, and dreams. Whether we're navigating relationships, battling inner fears, or seeking purpose, this debate between self and no self holds keys to unlocking a deeper understanding of our lives. So, join me as we step into this mystery together. Let's explore not just the ideas of Jung and the Buddha, but how they can transform the way we live, love, and see ourselves. In a quiet room bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, a man sits surrounded by books. The year is 1939, and we're in Switzerland. This man, Carl Jung, is deep in thought. His study is filled with the weight of countless volumes on mythology, psychology, and Eastern philosophy. Outside, the world trembles under the shadow of war. Yet here in this haven of quiet introspection, a revolution is brewing, not of politics or nations, but of the mind. Jung is contemplating a question that has haunted thinkers for centuries. What is the self? Now imagine another scene. The sun rises over a serene forest in ancient India, and a man sits beneath a Bodhi tree. His face is calm but focused, as if he is peering into the deepest mysteries of existence. This man, Siddhartha Gautama, is on the verge of an insight that will forever change the course of human thought. In the stillness, he realizes a truth so profound it dissolves all illusions. The self, as we know it, is not real. These two figures, Jung and the Buddha, lived worlds apart, yet their lives are bound by a shared quest to understand the nature of human consciousness. One sought to map the depths of the psyche through dreams and archetypes. The other sought liberation from suffering through meditation and wisdom. Their timelines and cultures may differ, but their journeys reveal an interconnected web of thought that transcends boundaries of time and place. Carl Jung's path began in the heart of Europe. Born in 1875 in Switzerland, he grew up in a household steeped in religion. His father was a pastor, and Jung's early life was shaped by questions about faith, spirituality, and the unseen forces that govern human life. As he grew older, Jung's curiosity deepened. He became a physician, but it wasn't the body that fascinated him. It was the mind. What made people dream? Why did certain symbols and stories seem to resonate universally across cultures and centuries? These questions led him to develop his groundbreaking theories of analytical psychology. Jung's work on the collective unconscious introduced the idea that beneath our individual experiences lies a shared reservoir of symbols, patterns, and archetypes. These archetypes of the hero, the mother, the shadow are not just literary devices. They are psychological realities that shape how we see the world and ourselves. But there was more. Jung's study of myths and religions brought him face to face with Eastern philosophies, and it was here that his fascination with the self began to deepen. One of the pivotal moments in Jung's life was his encounter with Richard Wilhelm, a translator of Chinese classics. Through Wilhelm, Jung discovered the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching. Texts that offered a radically different perspective on the nature of existence. Unlike Western traditions, which often emphasize a linear, individualistic view of the self, Eastern philosophies presented the self as fluid, interdependent, and ever-changing. For Jung, this was both a challenge and an inspiration. It resonated with his own observations in psychotherapy, where patients often struggled with rigid identities and found healing in embracing a more holistic view of themselves. Half a world away, Siddhartha Gautama embarked on a very different journey. Born into luxury as a prince, he had every reason to believe in the solidity of the self. After all, he was surrounded by wealth, power, and a clear sense of identity. But life had other plans. When Siddhartha encountered sickness, old age, and death, his illusions began to crumble. He left his palace, renounced his titles, and set out to understand the root of human suffering. For years, Siddhartha wandered, seeking answers from teachers and ascetics. He practiced extreme austerities, pushing his body to its limits in the hope that physical deprivation might bring spiritual clarity. But it was under the shade of the Bodhi tree that he finally found what he was looking for. Through deep meditation, he realized that suffering arises from attachment, not just to material things, but to the idea of a permanent, unchanging self. This insight became the cornerstone of his teachings, the doctrine of anatta, or no self. At its core, the Buddha's teaching of no self challenges our most basic assumptions. We tend to think of ourselves as fixed entities. I am this, I am that. But the Buddha saw through this illusion. He described the self as a collection of 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These aggregates interact and change constantly, like the parts of a chariot. Take the chariot apart, and where is its essence? Similarly, when we examine ourselves deeply, we find no fixed center, only a dynamic, interdependent flow of experiences. Jung's exploration of the self and the Buddha's insight into no self may seem like opposites, but they share a profound commonality. Both challenge the rigid boundaries of identity. Jung's concept of individuation, the process of integrating the conscious and unconscious mind, is not about strengthening the ego, but transcending its limitations. Likewise, the Buddha's path of liberation is not about erasing the self entirely, but understanding its illusory nature so that we can engage with life more freely and compassionately. Imagine a modern example. A young woman, Sarah, struggles with feelings of inadequacy. She believes she must constantly prove herself at work, in relationships, even in her hobbies. Her sense of self is tied to external validation, and the weight of these expectations is crushing her. One day, Sarah begins therapy with a Jungian psychologist. Through dream work, she starts to uncover her shadow, the parts of herself she's been avoiding. She dreams of a dark, endless ocean and a lighthouse that flickers in the distance. Her therapist helps her see that the ocean represents her unconscious fears, while the lighthouse symbolizes a guiding light within her. Simultaneously, Sarah takes up mindfulness meditation, inspired by Buddhist teachings. As she sits in silence, observing her breath, she begins to notice how her thoughts come and go, like clouds passing through the sky. For the first time, she realizes that she is not her thoughts or her fears, they are just phenomena, arising and fading away. Through these practices, Sarah experiences a profound shift. She no longer feels trapped by her self-concept. Instead, she starts to see herself as a process, not a product, as something fluid, adaptable, and interconnected. This transformation doesn't erase her struggles, but it changes how she relates to them. She learns to hold her fears lightly, to approach challenges with curiosity rather than judgment. In the language of Jung, she is individuating. In the language of the Buddha, she is awakening to no self. Jung and the Buddha remind us that the self is both more and less than we imagine. It is a lens through which we experience the world, but it is not the world itself. Their teachings invite us to loosen our grip on fixed identities and step into the spaciousness of being. In a world that often pressures us to define ourselves, to be something, to achieve something, to prove something, this perspective is liberating. As we sit with these ideas, let's return to that quiet room in Switzerland and that forest in India. Jung and the Buddha, separated by centuries, are united in their search for truth. Their paths remind us that understanding the self is not about arriving at a final answer, but embracing the journey itself. And perhaps, as we walk this path, we too will discover something timeless. The freedom that lies beyond the stories we tell about who we are. Part 2. The self that Jung built. Let's begin with a question that might linger in your mind long after this moment. What if your true self isn't just who you think you are, but also everything you've never dared to consider? Picture yourself walking through a dense, ancient forest. The sunlight barely filters through the thick canopy of leaves overhead. Each step feels both deliberate and uncertain, as if you're exploring not just a physical landscape, but an inner world, a world hidden in shadow, mystery, and silence. This is the terrain Carl Jung invites us to enter when we talk about the self. For Jung, the self isn't merely the person you see in the mirror, nor is it just the sum of your conscious thoughts, desires, and fears. It's a totality, a vast and intricate network that connects what you know about yourself to the endless depths of what you don't. Jung's journey into understanding the self began with a fascination that many of us share: the mystery of human experience. Why do we dream of things we don't understand? Why do certain symbols, an eagle in flight, a serpent coiled in the grass, a radiant circle, stir something deep within us, something primal and universal? Jung believed that the answers lay in what he called the collective unconscious, a reservoir of memories, patterns, and archetypes shared by all humanity. Imagine a quiet evening with Jung in his study, surrounded by shelves filled with ancient texts, mythological tales, and patient case files. He'd explain that these archetypes, universal symbols like the hero, the mother, the trickster, aren't just stories. They're the building blocks of the psyche. They live in all of us, shaping how we see the world and ourselves. But here's the paradox. To truly understand these archetypes, we must go beyond the conscious mind and delve into the unconscious, a place both wondrous and terrifying. For Jung, this journey was encapsulated in the process of individuation. It's a word that might sound clinical at first, but it's deeply poetic in its essence. Individuation is the path to wholeness, a process of integrating the fragmented pieces of our psyche, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming fully yourself, embracing both the known and the unknown with courage and curiosity. One of the first steps in this journey is confronting the shadow. The shadow isn't evil. It's simply the parts of ourselves we've disowned or suppressed. Perhaps it's an unacknowledged fear, a hidden desire, or a trait we've judged as unacceptable. Jung often described the shadow as the dark twin of the ego. But here's the beautiful irony. The shadow, when embraced, isn't a source of darkness. It's a doorway to light. Let me share a story of one of Jung's patients. Imagine a man named Thomas, a successful businessman who came to Jung with a recurring dream. In the dream, Thomas is wandering through a vast, dark cave. He carries a lantern, but it only lights the space directly in front of him, leaving the rest of the cave shrouded in shadow. He hears whispers, sees fleeting movements, but never understands what they mean. Over weeks of analysis, Jung helped Thomas see that the cave was his own unconscious, and the whispers were the parts of himself he'd neglected. His vulnerability, his longing for creativity, his fear of failure. By exploring these shadows, not fighting or fleeing from them, Thomas began to feel less fragmented, less haunted. His dreams changed. The cave became brighter, the whispers clearer. Another layer of individuation involves meeting the anima or animus, our inner feminine or masculine counterpart. Jung saw this as essential for achieving balance. For example, a man might have disowned his anima, the feminine aspect of his psyche, because he associates it with weakness. But in rejecting this part of himself, he also rejects qualities like intuition, empathy, and creativity. Similarly, a woman might disown her animus, losing touch with her assertiveness and strength. Individuation invites us to reclaim these parts of ourselves, not as opposites but as complementary forces that enrich our wholeness. Let me share another story, this time about Maria, a young artist who struggled with creative blocks. She came to Jung with dreams of a golden bird trapped in a cage. Jung interpreted the bird as Maria's animus, her creative energy, which had been stifled by her fear of criticism. Through their work together, Maria began to recognize her animus not as a threat but as an ally. She started taking bold steps in her art, painting not for approval but as an expression of her authentic self. In her final dream, the golden bird soared into the sky, free at last. The culmination of individuation is self-realization, a term that might sound lofty, but it's deeply personal and grounded. Self-realization isn't about achieving perfection. It's about embracing imperfection, finding beauty in the contradictions that make us human. Jung often used the image of the mandala. A circular symbol representing wholeness. To describe this state. He noticed that many of his patients, without any prior knowledge of Eastern spirituality, spontaneously created mandalas in their dreams or drawings. To Jung, this was no coincidence. It was the psyche's way of striving toward balance and integration. As you listen to these ideas, you might wonder how they apply to your own life. Perhaps you've felt the pull of opposing forces within you, the desire for freedom and the need for security, the longing to express yourself and the fear of judgment. Jung would say that these tensions aren't obstacles, they're opportunities. They're the cracks through which light enters, guiding you toward a deeper understanding of who you are. In our modern world, where we're often defined by roles and labels, parent, professional, partner, it's easy to lose touch with the vastness of our inner selves. But Jung reminds us that the self is more than a role or a label. It's a process, an ever-evolving journey. And like any journey, it requires both courage and surrender. Courage to face the shadows, and surrender to the mystery of what lies beyond. Let's return to that forest we imagined at the beginning. The sun is setting now, casting long shadows on the ground. But in the fading light, you notice something you hadn't seen before. The outlines of a path, winding its way deeper into the trees. It's not a straight path, and it's not always clear. But it's yours to walk, and every step brings you closer to wholeness. As you move forward, you carry with you the light of all you've discovered. And the promise of all you've yet to uncover. Part 3. Buddha's profound no-self insight. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. A still, quiet morning in a forest long ago. The sun filters through the canopy above, dappling the ground with patches of light and shadow. Beneath a Bodhi tree sits a man, motionless and serene. His breathing is steady, his presence unwavering. This is Siddhartha Gautama, the man we now call the Buddha. He is on the brink of a realization so profound, it will ripple through history and reshape how humanity understands the self. The Buddha's journey to this moment wasn't a straight path. It began in a palace of luxury, where he lived as a prince shielded from the realities of life. But cracks began to form in the perfect facade. One day, Siddhartha saw an old man, bent with age. Another day, a sick man struggling for breath. Finally, he witnessed the stillness of death. These sights shattered his illusions and planted a seed of inquiry. What is the source of human suffering, and how can it be overcome? This question led him to renounce his royal life and search for answers in the wilderness. He sought out teachers, practiced extreme austerities, and meditated for years. But it wasn't until he abandoned all pretense and sat quietly under the Bodhi tree that the truth emerged. The self, he realized, is not a fixed entity. It is not a solid, unchanging me that endures through time. Instead, what we call the self is a collection of ever-shifting experiences, a mirage that crumbles when we look closely. This insight became the teaching of anatta, or no-self. It is a radical idea even today. After all, don't we cling to the belief that there's a core I behind our thoughts, emotions, and actions? The Buddha invites us to investigate this belief through direct experience, not blind faith. He taught that what we take to be the self is actually composed of 5 aggregates, or skandhas: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Let's pause for a moment and explore these. Form is the body, the physical structure we inhabit. Sensation is the raw data we receive. Pleasure, pain, or neutrality. Perception is how we interpret these sensations, labeling them as good or bad. Mental formations are the habits, tendencies, and emotions that arise in response. Finally, consciousness is the awareness that perceives it all. Together, these five aggregates create the illusion of a cohesive self. But if you separate them, what remains? The Buddha often used metaphors to explain this. Imagine a chariot, he said. When you see it rolling down the road, it seems like a single entity. But what happens if you take it apart? The wheels, the axles, the frame. None of these, alone or together, is the chariot. It exists only as a concept, a convenient label. In the same way, the self exists as an idea, not as a permanent reality. Another famous story illustrates this point. In the ancient Buddhist text The Questions of King Milinda, a Greek king named Milinda engages in a dialogue with the monk Nagasena. When Milinda asks Nagasena his name, the monk replies, "Nagasena is just a designation, a label for the collection of body, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. There is no permanent Nagasena to be found." The king struggles to grasp this, but slowly begins to see that what he thought of as a fixed self is as ephemeral as a flame. This teaching isn't just abstract philosophy. It has deeply practical implications. The belief in a solid self is at the root of much of our suffering. We cling to identities. I am successful. I am unworthy. I am this. I am that. And these identities bind us. They lead to attachment, aversion, and the endless push and pull of wanting and rejecting. When we let go of the notion of a permanent self, we loosen these bonds and begin to experience life with more freedom and ease. Consider a modern example. Imagine a woman named Emily who is consumed by her role as a perfectionist. She believes she must excel in her career, relationships, and personal achievements to be worthy of love and respect. Every mistake feels like a threat to her identity, and every success feels fleeting. One day, Emily begins practicing mindfulness meditation, inspired by Buddhist teachings. As she sits in stillness, observing her thoughts, she notices something remarkable. Her thoughts are not static. They come and go like clouds across the sky. She begins to see that the perfectionist Emily is just a story her mind tells. A story she no longer has to believe. This shift doesn't mean Emily loses all sense of self. On the contrary, it allows her to engage with life more fully. She can still strive for excellence, but without the weight of needing to prove her worth. She can still care for others, but without losing herself in the process. By loosening her grip on the fixed identity of perfectionist, Emily discovers the spaciousness of simply being. The Buddha emphasized that this insight isn't about erasing the self, but about seeing it clearly. It's like holding a snowflake in your hand. You can admire its beauty without expecting it to last forever. Similarly, you can engage with your roles and identities. Parent, friend, artist. Without clinging to them as your ultimate essence. This understanding brings not just freedom, but compassion. When we realize that the self is a fluid, interdependent process, we see that others are just like us. Caught in the same web of thoughts, emotions, and desires. This insight dissolves the barriers between self and other, opening the door to genuine connection. The Buddha once said, "When one sees with wisdom that all conditioned things are impermanent, one turns away from suffering." It's not a turning away in despair, but a turning toward life as it is. Beautiful, fleeting, and interconnected. Imagine standing on the edge of a vast ocean at sunrise. The waves rise and fall, each unique yet inseparable from the whole. This is how the Buddha invites us to see ourselves. Not as isolated drops, but as part of a boundless sea. And in this view, there is peace. Not the peace of escaping life, but the peace of embracing it fully, without clinging or fear. So, as we reflect on this teaching of no self, let's carry its lessons into our own lives. Let's question the identities we hold so tightly, the stories we tell about who we are. Let's approach ourselves with curiosity and kindness, knowing that freedom lies not in becoming something new, but in discovering the truth of what we already are. A flowing, ever-changing process, as vast and open as the sky. Part 4. Clash or complement? The meeting of two perspectives. Are Carl Jung and the Buddha locked in opposition, or do they secretly agree on the nature of existence? This question invites us to sit quietly, as if in the middle of a calm lake at dusk, watching ripples fade into stillness. On one side of the lake, we see Jung, holding a lantern to illuminate the depths of the self. On the other, the Buddha quietly dismantling the very idea of the self. Their positions may seem like a clash, yet when we pause and listen deeply, a harmony begins to emerge. Jung's concept of the self and the Buddha's teaching of no self appear, at first glance, to pull in opposite directions. Jung's self is the center of wholeness, the totality that integrates the conscious and unconscious. For him, the self is the ultimate aim of individuation, the process of becoming whole. On the other hand, the Buddha's no self, or anatta, reveals the self as a constructed illusion, a bundle of impermanent experiences with no fixed core. It's tempting to frame these views as contradictory, but what if they are two sides of the same coin? Let's begin with Jung. He believed that the self was more than just the ego, the conscious identity we associate with I. For Jung, the ego is merely the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lies the vast unconscious, filled with archetypes, memories, and instincts that shape us without our awareness. The self, in Jung's view, encompasses both the ego and the unconscious. It's the totality of who we are, including the parts we hide or repress. Jung often likened the self to a mandala, a circular symbol representing wholeness. Imagine standing before a mandala. Its intricate patterns draw your eye inward, toward the center, but also outward, toward the circumference. This mirrors the journey of individuation. To become whole, Jung said, we must embrace all aspects of ourselves, even the parts that frighten or discomfort us. It's not about strengthening the ego, but about transcending its limitations. Now let's turn to the Buddha. His teaching of no self dismantles the very foundation of a fixed identity. The Buddha taught that clinging to the idea of a permanent self is the root of suffering. What we call the self is simply a collection of 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These aggregates are impermanent and interdependent, like waves rising and falling in the ocean. When we grasp at them, trying to solidify our identity, we create suffering. But when we let go, we find freedom. At first glance, these perspectives seem to diverge. Jung appears to build the self up, while the Buddha tears it down. But if we look closer, we see that both are pointing to the same underlying truth. The ego, or the self as we commonly understand it, is not the whole story. Jung and the Buddha both acknowledge that the ego is necessary. It helps us navigate the world, form relationships, and make decisions. Yet they also agree that clinging to the ego as the ultimate reality leads to fragmentation and suffering. Imagine a bird with 2 wings. One wing represents Jung's self, the totality of conscious and unconscious elements. The other wing represents the Buddha's no self, the insight that the self is fluid and impermanent. Both wings are essential for flight. If we focus only on one, we lose balance. Together, they allow us to soar. Let's bring this to life with a modern example. Meet David, a high-achieving executive who prides himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life. His identity is tied to his role, his success, his power, his decisions. But beneath the surface, David feels hollow. He's plagued by dreams of falling into a dark abyss, and no amount of achievement seems to fill the void. David begins therapy with a Jungian psychologist. Through dream analysis, he confronts his shadow, the parts of himself he's disowned, like his vulnerability and fear of failure. He starts to see that his identity as a successful executive is just one facet of his self, not its entirety. At the same time, David takes up mindfulness meditation. As he sits in stillness, observing his thoughts, he notices how they come and go, like clouds drifting across the sky. He begins to see that the self he's clung to is an illusion, a story he's been telling himself. Through these practices, David doesn't lose himself. Instead, he gains a deeper understanding of who he truly is, a fluid, ever-changing being connected to something greater. Jung's individuation and the Buddha's no-self work together to help David find balance. He no longer feels the need to control everything, and he discovers a sense of freedom and authenticity he's never known. This harmony between Jung and the Buddha lies in their shared recognition of paradox. Jung described the self as containing all opposites, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious. The Buddha taught that by seeing through the illusion of a fixed self, we transcend dualities like self and other, gain and loss. Both invite us to move beyond rigid identities and embrace the fullness of existence. In our modern lives, these teachings hold profound relevance. We live in a world that often demands we define ourselves in narrow terms, our job titles, social roles, or political affiliations. This creates a sense of separation between us and others, and even within ourselves. Jung and the Buddha remind us that we are more than these labels. We are not static beings, but dynamic processes, always in flux. Consider the metaphor of a river. At any given moment, the river appears constant. It flows in its familiar channel, reflecting the sky above. But if you look closely, you'll see that the water is never the same. New currents replace old ones, and the river's shape shifts with time. The self, too, is like this, both real in its appearance and impermanent in its essence. So, are Jung and the Buddha in conflict? Or are they collaborators in the same great inquiry? The answer, perhaps, is that they offer us two lenses through which to see the same truth. Jung's lens helps us integrate and embrace the complexity of who we are. The Buddha's lens helps us let go of attachment to a false sense of self. Together, they guide us toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. As we sit with these ideas, let's return to the image of the lake. The ripples have faded now, leaving the surface smooth and clear. In its reflection, we see not two opposing figures, but two perspectives converging. Their teachings invite us to explore the vastness of our inner worlds, to hold the paradox of self and no-self with grace. And in doing so, we may find not a definitive answer, but a profound sense of freedom. One that transcends the boundaries of who we think we are. Part 5, Transforming Suffering. Point 2, Paths to Freedom. What if the way out of suffering isn't about fixing yourself, but letting go of who you think you are? Imagine for a moment that you're holding a rope, tightly knotted and tangled. The more you pull and strain, the tighter the knots become. This rope is like the stories we tell about ourselves, the identities we cling to, the pain we hold, the desires that tie us in endless loops. Both Carl Jung and the Buddha saw this struggle, and each offered a path to freedom. Their ways differ in expression but converge in their ultimate goal: to transform suffering into wisdom and peace. In the heart of Jung's teachings lies the concept of individuation. It's a word that feels dense and academic, but its essence is deeply human and poetic. Individuation is the process of becoming whole, of uniting all the fragmented parts of yourself into a cohesive, authentic being. For Jung, this isn't about perfection. It's about integration, bringing light to the shadowy corners of your psyche and embracing both the beauty and the complexity of who you are. To begin this journey, Jung believed we must first face the shadow, the parts of ourselves we hide, deny, or reject. It's a challenging step, like descending into a dark cave. But as Jung often reminded his patients, the treasures of the soul are hidden in the darkness. Consider a patient from his practice, a man named Paul, who struggled with a deep sense of inadequacy. Paul projected confidence to the world, yet inside, he carried the weight of shame and self-doubt. Through dream analysis, Paul began to encounter his shadow. In one dream, he stood before a locked door, behind which a wild, snarling animal waited. Jung helped him see that the animal represented his repressed anger and fear, emotions he had long avoided. As Paul worked to integrate these parts of himself, something remarkable happened. He began to feel lighter, freer. The anger he once feared became a source of strength, guiding him to set boundaries and speak his truth. The shame that once defined him lost its grip, revealing a quieter confidence. Individuation didn't erase Paul's struggles. It transformed his relationship with them, allowing him to live more fully. Now imagine a path not through the psyche but through the vast landscape of existence itself. This is the Buddha's Eightfold Path. a way of living that leads not to wholeness but to liberation. At its core, the Eightfold Path is about letting go of attachment, clinging, and the illusions that bind us. It's a map guiding us from suffering to freedom, from confusion to clarity. The path begins with right view, seeing life as it truly is, impermanent and interconnected. From there, it flows into right intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Each step invites us to examine how we relate to the world and to ourselves. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from attachment, not just to material things but to ideas, identities, and desires. When we loosen our grip, we create space for freedom and joy. Let's bring this teaching to life with a story. In one of the Buddha's parables, a man is crossing a river. He builds a sturdy raft to carry him to the other side. But once he reaches the shore, he refuses to let go of the raft, even as it becomes a burden. The Buddha asked his followers, would it be wise for the man to carry the raft on his back? Of course not. The raft was a tool, not a possession. Similarly, the identities and attachments we carry can serve us for a time, but clinging to them when they no longer serve becomes a source of suffering. Consider a modern parallel. Sarah, a devoted mother, finds herself at a crossroads when her children grow up and leave home. For years, her identity was tied to being a caregiver. Now she feels adrift, unsure of who she is without this role. Inspired by mindfulness practices, Sarah begins to sit quietly each morning, observing her thoughts. She notices how her mind clings to the idea of mother as her defining identity. Slowly, she starts to let go not of her love for her children, but of the belief that her worth depends on them needing her. As Sarah releases this attachment, she discovers new aspects of herself, her creativity, her curiosity, her longing for connection beyond her family. The Buddha's teachings don't ask her to abandon her identity, but to see it as one part of a larger, fluid self. Like the man with the raft, Sarah learns to carry her roles lightly, using them as tools rather than burdens. Jung and the Buddha offer us complementary lenses for understanding suffering. Jung's path of individuation helps us embrace the full spectrum of who we are, integrating the shadow and the light. The Buddha's Eightfold Path guides us to transcend the self altogether, dissolving the illusion of separation. Together, they remind us that suffering isn't something to be fixed or fought. It's a teacher pointing us toward the freedom that comes from letting go. In our modern lives, where stress and striving often dominate, these teachings hold profound relevance. We live in a culture that glorifies achievement, identity, and control. Yet both Jung and the Buddha remind us that true peace doesn't come from grasping but from releasing. They ask us to look inward, not with judgment but with compassion, and to trust that the way out of suffering is already within us. So, as you sit with these ideas, imagine the rope again. It's not slowly loosening in your hands. Feel the tension ease, the weight lift. Whether you follow Jung's journey into the depths of the psyche or the Buddha's path toward liberation, know that both lead to the same destination. A life lived with clarity, courage, and grace. And perhaps, as you walk this path, you'll find that the freedom you seek isn't about becoming something new. It's about coming home to the truth of who you already are. Part 6. Practical Tools for the Modern Seeker. How can ancient wisdom and modern psychology help you navigate today's challenges? Imagine sitting by a still lake at dawn, the air cool and crisp, the water mirroring the pastel hues of the sky. In that quiet, reflective moment, you sense the possibility of clarity, of seeing life as it truly is. This is the promise of combining the insights of Carl Jung and the Buddha, an opportunity to weave their profound teachings into the fabric of modern life, making it richer, calmer, and more meaningful. Let's begin with a tool that Jung cherished: dream analysis. Jung believed that dreams are like letters from the unconscious, filled with symbols and stories waiting to be unraveled. Imagine, for example, you dream of climbing a steep mountain, carrying a heavy backpack. At the summit, you open the bag to find it empty. What might this mean? Jung would encourage you to explore the symbols: the mountain as a challenge, the backpack as a burden, the emptiness as a revelation. Dreams like these aren't puzzles with a single answer. They're mirrors reflecting your inner world. Take Sarah, a teacher struggling with burnout. Night after night, she dreams of running through endless corridors, searching for a door that's always just out of reach. Through dream analysis, Sarah realizes the door symbolizes rest, something she's been denying herself. This insight doesn't magically fix her life, but it sparks a shift. She begins setting boundaries at work, carving out time to recharge. Her dreams change too. Now she dreams of walking through a forest, finding a clearing bathed in sunlight. The unconscious, once a source of confusion, becomes a guide toward balance. Now consider mindfulness meditation, a cornerstone of Buddhist practice. It's deceptively simple. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, and observe your breath. But in that simplicity lies profound transformation. Mindfulness isn't about clearing your mind or escaping reality. It's about meeting reality with openness and curiosity. Each inhale and exhale becomes a tether, grounding you in the present moment. Imagine Tom, a software developer plagued by anxiety. His mind races with worries about deadlines and what others think of him. He begins practicing mindfulness for just 5 minutes a day. At first, it's uncomfortable. His thoughts feel louder than ever. But gradually, he notices something. His thoughts are like clouds drifting across the sky. They come and go, but the sky. His awareness. Remains vast and unshaken. This realization doesn't erase his anxiety, but it loosens its grip. Tom starts to respond to challenges with a steadier heart, finding pockets of peace even in chaos. Another technique rooted in Jung's work is active imagination. This practice invites you to dialogue with your unconscious, bringing its symbols to life. It's like daydreaming with intention. Imagine closing your eyes and revisiting that mountain from your dream, or sitting beside a wise old figure who appeared in a vision. What would you ask them? What might they say? Active imagination bridges the conscious and unconscious, offering insights that feel both surprising and deeply personal. Take Maria, an artist who feels stuck. She uses active imagination to revisit a recurring image from her dreams, a silver river winding through a desert. In her mind's eye, she follows the river, meeting a bird that perches on her shoulder. "What do you need?" she asks the bird. "To fly," it replies. This simple exchange inspires Maria to take a leap in her waking life, pursuing a creative project she'd been too afraid to start. Active imagination, like mindfulness, isn't about escaping reality but engaging with it more fully. The beauty of these practices is their accessibility. You don't need a quiet retreat or hours of free time to begin. You can reflect on a dream while sipping your morning coffee, practice mindfulness during your commute, or engage in active imagination while journaling at night. These tools meet you where you are, helping you navigate life's complexities with greater clarity and compassion. But what about relationships? Both Jung and the Buddha understood that our inner world shapes how we connect with others. Jung emphasized the importance of integrating the shadow, those hidden parts of ourselves that often project onto others. The Buddha taught that attachment to the self creates barriers, while recognizing no self fosters empathy and connection. Imagine a couple, Emma and Liam, who often clash over small disagreements. Emma begins noticing that her frustration with Liam's indecisiveness mirrors her own fear of making mistakes. Liam realizes his annoyance with Emma's strong opinions reflects his struggle to assert himself. By embracing these insights, they stop blaming each other and start growing together. Emma becomes more patient with Liam's process, and Liam finds his voice. Their relationship deepens, not because they've eliminated conflict, but because they've learned to navigate it with self-awareness and mutual respect. These tools also extend to finding purpose. In a world that often equates worth with productivity, both Jung and the Buddha remind us to look inward. Jung encouraged his patients to follow their dharma, not in the Buddhist sense of universal truth, but as an inner calling. The Buddha, meanwhile, taught that purpose arises naturally when we align our actions with wisdom and compassion. Consider Maya, a lawyer who feels unfulfilled despite her success. Through mindfulness, she realizes her dissatisfaction stems not from her job, but from how she's approached it as a means to an end rather than a service to others. She begins volunteering her legal skills to support underserved communities, finding a renewed sense of meaning. Her work doesn't change, but her relationship to it does. Purpose, she learns, isn't about what you do, it's about why and how you do it. These practices, dream analysis, mindfulness, active imagination, aren't about escaping life's challenges, but meeting them with curiosity and courage. They remind us that the answers we seek aren't out there, but within us, waiting to be discovered. And they invite us to see ourselves not as fixed entities, but as ever-evolving beings, capable of growth and transformation. As the sun sets on this journey, imagine once more that still lake at dawn. Its surface reflects not just the sky above, but the depths below. In this reflection, you see yourself not as a single, unchanging image, but as a dynamic, interconnected whole. The tools of Jung and the Buddha don't offer quick fixes, but they do offer a path, a way to navigate the complexities of modern life with greater clarity, compassion, and purpose. And perhaps, as you walk this path, you'll find that the wisdom of these ancient teachings is not distant or abstract, but profoundly, beautifully alive in your own experience. Part 7, Beyond Self and No Self. What if the truth about you lies not in who you are, but in what happens when you stop asking? Imagine standing on the edge of a quiet forest, where the wind whispers through the trees and the sunlight dances on the leaves. There's a path ahead, winding and uncertain, yet inviting. It doesn't promise answers, only the journey itself. This is the space where Carl Jung's self-realization and the Buddha's liberation meet, a place beyond the confines of identity, where paradox becomes the key to freedom. Jung believed in the process of individuation, the lifelong journey of integrating the conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, into a cohesive whole. The self, in his view, is not a static entity but a dynamic totality that encompasses all aspects of our psyche. It is both the center and the circumference of our being, containing opposites in harmony. For Jung, the self is the destination of psychological wholeness, a state of profound acceptance and balance. The Buddha, on the other hand, spoke of liberation through anatta, the teaching of no self. He saw the self as a construct, a collection of impermanent experiences bound by attachment and clinging. Liberation comes not from integrating the self, but from transcending it, letting go of the illusion that we are a fixed, unchanging I. This isn't annihilation but awakening, the realization that freedom lies in embracing the flow of existence without grasping at permanence. At first glance, these paths seem to diverge. Jung's self appears to affirm identity, while the Buddha's no self dissolves it. But when we step back, like viewing a mandala from a distance, the symmetry emerges. Both perspectives lead us beyond the narrow confines of ego, beyond the illusions that bind us. They invite us to see ourselves not as isolated beings, but as dynamic processes, deeply interconnected with the world around us. Consider the paradox of selfhood, how we can be both everything and nothing at once. Jung described the self as containing all opposites, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, good and evil. The Buddha pointed to the emptiness at the heart of existence, where all things are interdependent and devoid of inherent selfhood. These ideas are not contradictions but complements, two lenses through which to view the same truth. Imagine a raindrop falling into the ocean. For a moment, it retains its shape, distinct and individual. But as it merges with the vastness of the sea, it loses its boundaries and becomes something greater. This is the paradox of self and no self. We are like the raindrop, unique in our experiences yet inseparable from the larger whole. Jung's self-realization honors the distinctness of the raindrop, while the Buddha's liberation celebrates its union with the ocean. Let's bring these ideas to life with a story. Meet Anna, a musician who feels torn between her passion for art and her family's expectations. She struggles with the question, who am I? A daughter, an artist, or something else entirely? In therapy, Anna explores her dreams and discovers recurring images of a river splitting into two streams. Her therapist helps her see that these streams represent the opposing forces in her life, pulling her in different directions. At the same time, Anna begins practicing mindfulness meditation. As she sits quietly, observing her breath, she notices how her thoughts shift and flow, much like the river in her dreams. She realizes that she doesn't have to choose between the streams. She can flow with both, without clinging to one identity or the other. This insight doesn't provide a definitive answer to, "Who am I?" but it frees her from the need to ask. She begins to live her life with a sense of openness, embracing both her roles without being confined by them. This convergence of self and no-self is not just a philosophical idea. It's a practical way to navigate the complexities of modern life. In a world that often demands we define ourselves in rigid terms, our job titles, social roles, or achievements. Jung and the Buddha remind us that we are more than these labels. We are not static beings but dynamic processes, capable of growth and transformation. Take another example, this time of David, a retired engineer grappling with a loss of purpose. For decades, his identity was tied to his career. Now, without it, he feels adrift, questioning his worth. Through dream analysis, David uncovers a recurring symbol in his unconscious. A lighthouse, its beams sweeping across a dark sea. His therapist helps him see that the lighthouse represents his inner guidance, a reminder that his value is not tied to external roles. Simultaneously, David attends a meditation retreat where he contemplates the question, who is it that thinks? This practice leads him to see that his thoughts, fears, and desires are like waves on the ocean, not separate from him, but not the entirety of him either. He begins to experience a sense of spaciousness, a freedom from the need to cling to any one identity. Like the lighthouse, his true self is not fixed but fluid, guiding him through the ever-changing tides of life. Jung's Individuation and the Buddha's liberation both lead to a profound truth, that freedom comes not from holding on to a fixed self but from embracing the paradox of selfhood. To become whole, Jung teaches us to integrate the fragments of our psyche. To awaken, the Buddha shows us how to let go of the illusion of separation. Together, they remind us that wholeness and liberation are not opposites but complementary paths toward the same universal truth. As you reflect on these teachings, imagine once more that quiet forest. The path ahead is not linear, but winding and mysterious. Each step invites you to explore the depths of who you are, to hold the paradox of everything and nothing with grace. And perhaps, as you walk this path, you'll find that the truth about you isn't something to be discovered but something to be lived moment by moment, with clarity, courage, and compassion. Now that we've explored the self and the no-self, let me leave you with one final question. Who are you when you're not trying to be anyone at all? As we draw this journey to a close, take a moment to reflect. Carl Jung and the Buddha, separated by centuries and cultures, both pointed us toward freedom. Jung showed us the path to psychological wholeness through individuation, the integration of all that we are, both light and shadow. The Buddha taught us that freedom comes when we let go of clinging to the illusion of a permanent self. Two paths, one truth, that we are more and less than we think. What's the takeaway? Perhaps it's this: you don't need to fix yourself. You don't need to become someone else. Instead, step back and observe. Watch the story you tell about yourself unravel. In the space that remains, you'll find not emptiness, but peace. Not nothingness, but connection to everything. So, I invite you to take these ideas into your life. Reflect on them, question them, and most importantly, live them. How can you let go of rigid identities and embrace the fluid, ever-changing process of being? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what resonated with you, what challenged you, and how this exploration has sparked your curiosity. And if this journey has opened a door for you, don't stop here. Like this video, share it with someone who might need these insights, and subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings. Together, we'll continue exploring the profound questions that shape our lives. Until next time, may your path be lit with clarity, courage, and compassion. Thank you for joining me on this journey. See you in the next chapter.